Come, spell weavers, reavers, rogues, and men-at-arms, and answer the call of adventure. Pick up your sword, your axe, your spellbook, your bow, your rulebook, and your dice, and join the forces of good in their eternal fight against vile monsters, conspiring min-maxers, horny bards, and blood-soaked murder hobos. Discover the treasure trove of role-playing games here on Rollin' Bones. My name is Ryan Howard, and I shall be your guide. Good evening, Boneheads, and welcome back to Rollin' Bones with Ryan Howard, your RPG treasure trove, where we are making old school young again. I'm your host and king of the Boneheads, Ryan Howard. I'm put the R in OSR, and joining us once again this evening is someone who, if you've seen the show in any of its various formats for any length of time, you've seen this guy, you've heard this guy, you should be listening to his podcast, the Knights and Nerds podcast. He is a great dungeon master and a great friend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to Rollin' Bones, Tim Mathias.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me again, Ryan.
Absolutely. It's always great to have you on the show.
I feel undeserving of such an introduction.
You absolutely deserve it. Absolutely.
All right. We'll see if you feel the same come the end of the episode.
Cool. So, as the title of the stream suggests, we are going to be talking all about villains tonight. How to create villains, how to introduce villains, how to run villains. And I figured this would be a good topic to bring Tim on because you have done a show in the past, slash are still, I guess, doing a show all about creating villains. You've gone through the 5th edition Player's Handbook and made villains based on the class archetypes presented there. And you've made some great villains for the campaigns that you've run on Knights and Nerds. So, I figured this would be a topic that you would be well-equipped to discuss with us tonight.
I hope so. We'll see.
Absolutely. And hello to Grognard Nightmares and Dueling Dragon Adventures in chat. Glad you guys could join us this evening. And hello to everyone who is just now joining us. So to begin at the beginning here of the conversation, I'm actually going to back up several steps. And let's talk a little bit about writing in general. Because in addition to being a great dungeon master, you are also a writer.
I did write a trilogy of fantasy novels, yeah, and sometimes I forget. Occasionally, I'll get like a couple bucks from Amazon. I'll be like, "Oh yeah, I kind of did that thing." Yeah, I wrote a trilogy, and like the podcast was originally started because I was like, I want to drive more people to the books, which I hardly ever mention anymore, which is funny.
But I want to pose this question to you because this is something that's been kind of, bouncing around in my head as I've been thinking about this. When it comes to narratives, specifically when it comes to the identity of the villain, the ultimate showdown with the villain, and kind of the resolution to the overall conflict, do you think it's important that any of those events remain a secret to the reader, or in the context of role-playing games, to the players, up until the point where they actually find themselves confronted by the villain, or in the final showdown with him, or, resolving kind of the ultimate story that they're experiencing? Do you think any of that has to be completely 100% shrouded in mystery?
I think it's good to have some like mystique around your villain. I think it also depends on the context, like your game specific. If it's a mystery, then yeah, having the unknowns be something that the characters have to work through up until the point where they solve it is going to be really important. But um, I think for them to know certain things beforehand is totally okay. If you're running, I guess, like a real sort of typical adventure, a lot of people like to introduce their villains or some of their villains up front, um, and that way the players can really stew on what they're up against, which I think is just as effective as the mystery part, is like knowing what you're going up against and wondering all the time, are you equipped for it?
Hmm. The reason I ask this question is something that I have kind of I I don't know. It's hard to almost put into words. I've found as I've kind of gotten older and experienced more stories, there's this tendency in modern storytelling to want to want a shocking reveal or a surprise twist, usually more than one. And I feel like this need to have a shocking twist has hamstrung a lot of otherwise perfectly fine stories. And I almost want to discourage anyone who is trying to come up with a villain for their RPG campaign from trying to replicate a twist style story or villain, because all you're going to do is just continually doubt yourself out of any good ideas you may have had.
Yeah, getting a twist right is tough, and I don't know if it's a trope. I mean, I did it in my first campaign. I had well, I don't know if I had a plot twist rather than a secret that eventually got revealed. Um, I think there was at least one twist in there. Um, but yeah, if it becomes too tropish, then is it a twist? Not not to have a twist. I think that's something that somebody's probably asked before, but um, yeah, I don't think a huge reveal is really necessary. And I think in my current campaign that I'm running, I think I shied away from that a little bit. I think there was a reveal, but at the point, I think the players had already figured stuff out, so it wasn't a huge gasp moment. It was more like an affirmation of what they had already suspected.
Hmm. And I think what you did in the first campaign, uh, with Eldon and the Mind Flayers. Spoilers for Tim's first campaign. I should have said that beforehand, but you guys should have all listened to it already. Uh, you did something there that I feel like a lot of people forget to do, which is you laid groundwork and presented evidence to the players, to the listeners. In theory, someone could have put the pieces together, and I think maybe even a couple audience members, and maybe even I think Tom at a certain point actually started putting pieces together and was like, "There's mind flayers here,"
Yeah.
but I feel like it's important to have a mystery that your players or your audience can solve even before you're kind of ready to reveal to them the ultimate secret. And I feel like that distinguishes itself from just the out of nowhere twist that no one could have ever guessed, and it's that way because you don't want anyone to guess it. When you're trying to outsmart your audience or your players, I feel like that's where you run into dangerous territory, where you're actually just doing yourself more harm than good.
Yeah. I I listened to a podcast called I think it was called The GM's Guide. It was by a guy named Dan Felder, and this was years ago, like probably a couple years before I started recording campaign one. And he had said he was a game designer, I think, for was it BioWare at the time? Anyways, so um, it may have been EA. Anyways, so he had said in his podcast, which I would recommend anybody to go listen to, if it's still up, that a good twist has to be post-dictable. So once the twist gets revealed, you have to be able to go back to the various um, beats that have come before and
Mhm.
say, "Oh, that's what that was. That makes sense." So the audience has to, the players have to feel, um, uh, you know, like it wasn't just a surprise that they couldn't have anticipated. And it's an extra challenge for a game, as opposed to like writing a story, because a story you have absolute control over, but a game, you know, you you as the dungeon master, you want things to unfold in a certain way, but the players are going to figure things out in their own on their own time,
Yeah.
which may be ahead of your schedule, and it usually is.
Mhm. Yeah, and Nightmare makes a point here in chat that the world needs mystery. There has to be mysteries for your players to uncover, but the villain maybe doesn't necessarily require uh, a complete mystery. It's okay if your players know who they're up against early on.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I read a lot of posts in dungeon master advice forums, and certainly I think introducing a villain who is way higher tier than the characters are near the start of the campaign is totally acceptable. Nothing at all wrong with that. It telegraphs to them, like, this is the power level of this villain. They could witness this villain taking out a powerful NPC, or maybe this villain just is so powerful that it ignores the party altogether. Um, Knowing who you're up against is nothing at all wrong with that. You don't need to bake in mystery. Um, Something that you could easily do to you know incorporate some elements of the unknown is, like, what exactly is this villain capable of? And you can sort of you know draw back the curtain slowly throughout the game as the players rise and level as they proceed to meet this challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I'm gonna dust off an old example here from one of our previous conversations on your show. I am going to bring out of mothballs our old friend, Lord Sarkhan the One-Eyed, and he will be my example villain, kind of for the conversations moving forward. And so I'm bringing him up. One, to transition us specifically more into the villain conversation, uh, but to talk a little bit more about mystery around a villain. It's perfectly reasonable for players to know who Sarkhan the One-Eyed is and see him. They see his armies marching through the streets. They see him giving a speech from, the parapets of his castle, telling all the people that they will bend the knee in submission to him, or they will face the consequence and the sharp end of his blade. But at the same time, I feel like an essential part of any campaign is, even though you know who Sarkhan the One-Eyed is, you have to find out who Sarkhan the One-Eyed is. In that you need to find out what makes this man work. How does he conduct his business? What's going on in that twisted mind of his? What are his strengths? What are his weaknesses? I feel like that is essential to ultimately kind of undoing the evil deeds of any villain that you encounter in an RPG. And so that's a place where I think mystery ends up being essential.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're preparing Sarkhan the One-Eyed to be introduced into your story, I mean, you have to figure out, what does he want? Every character wants something, and certainly, any villain that can be overcome by sheer brute force is going to be maybe a little bit forgettable. And if you want this campaign, even if it's not like the main villain, like at the end of the campaign, but maybe like at the end of a certain act or at the end of a certain chapter, like you want your characters, your bad guy characters, to be memorable. And so having them fleshed out with their wants, with their weaknesses, it's not only integral and good character building, but it's really an opportunity for the players to interact with that world. It creates, really strong sense of reality, of verisimilitude. I think is an important word that gets that we can use to just to make sure that this character isn't just totally one-dimensional, and certainly rewarding for your players for them to gain something valuable that's not like a magic item or or a bonus to their die rolls. For example, it's something valuable narratively that also can translate into how they eventually win.
Oh, it looks like Victor Gorchev has joined us. Hey, Vic. Welcome. Welcome. But yeah, going off of what you said there about introducing narrative concepts rather than like straight up just, here's the sword that you have to stab him with. Here's your, what is it? The silver arrow that kills Ganon in the original Legend of Zelda. Instead of presenting your players with that, having it be a piece of lore or a piece of information, I think that's something that's overlooked a lot of times, because so often I feel like GMs will default to this villain is a physical threat to the party, in that if you guys roll initiative right now, he's going to do some serious damage to you, and most of you are probably going to die, if not all of you. But I think a lot of times you can get more mileage out of a villain that's kind of a moral or intellectual threat to the players. A villain who, maybe they could muster their forces, kick down the door, and ultimately take him down, 4 or 5 or 6 to 1. But there is something preventing them from doing that. Usually a hostage or some kind of machination that the villain has in place. And so I think in those cases it's better to have a piece of lore, a piece of information, a closely guarded secret that the players have to seek out, and maybe even have to seek out the fact that there is something out there for them to learn to overcome this threat.
Yeah, I just realized that I make my players fill out like a character questionnaire to help them sort of better understand their characters and their place in the world. And I realized that it'd be really good for dungeon masters or game masters to do the same thing with your antagonists. Have a list of questions that if you are asking your player characters, like, what's your most valued possession? What's a secret you don't want anybody to know? What's a rumor about you? It would be super helpful if you did that for your own villains and antagonists. And I totally agree with what you said about having your villains being not just brute force. If you're fighting a Tarrasque, great. It's a force of nature, but it's more of an entity and not really a character. Mm-hmm. Having a villain that is smart, which is why I chose the bad guys that I did for campaign 1, because that was like the most terrifying aspect to me about mind flayers. I mean, eating brains was a close second, but like the intelligence, the sheer like horrifying intellect that they possess is really the scary part. So having a villain, an enemy that can outsmart you, is really great. And having your players outsmart them, I think, is maybe the pinnacle
Yeah.
of gaming moments. And certainly having them be able to discover things, weaknesses, secrets, hideouts. Striking the villain where they're weak would be, really great.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it really is interesting when you think about the great villains of D&D, how many of them just like the concept alone is something that creeps you out. Mind flayers are the perfect example of this. Because I think you even said this in one of your behind the screen episodes. A mind flayer, like a single mind flayer, is not a physical threat to most high level parties or even most like mid level parties. Taking away all of its other abilities, it's, not really that threatening. But you add in this ability to control minds, all of the kind of layers of mind flayer psychology and just the way they operate. That's where the threat comes in. That's where the creepiness comes in. And then you can add stuff on top of it like spell casting and other crazy things to make the full threat that is a mind flayer. But I think what it comes down to, what's so intimidating about the mind flayer right off the bat is just the image, the visual of the mind flayer is something that's very kind of striking to players. So when it comes to designing your villains, how much emphasis do you place on the physical description of what your villain looks like and how that translates to, what kind of intimidation they bring to the table?
Oh, I mean that's a great question, and I I wish I was better at visualizing things like that. I think that is a huge weakness of mine is clearly visualizing characters that I make up. Uh, I I don't think that I'm I don't think I've got any aptitude with it at all, and certainly like it's hard to compete with a classic D&D monster that's been around for decades. Um, I guess what I've done is I try to, I guess, like employ this kind of cheap writing trick of like describing one specific thing about a character, um, and then the players' minds generally fill in the rest. I described Bryce in this current campaign as having a jawline scar and that he's kind of short in stature. And had I think I said he had a man bun, but and wears full plate armor. And I think like just a few specific things like that. I can't remember if it was in Stephen King's book on writing that he talks about like describe a couple of things in very specific detail, and people's minds generally fill in the rest. Um, I think someone like Andrew Kolb, who is an artist and also a game master and a game designer, I think he would be much stronger in terms of like, well, he's done it in his books Oz and Neverland of making characters and describing them and drawing them and presenting them to everybody. It's not my forte, but hopefully everybody else doesn't have the same hurdle that I do.
Yeah, I found that one of the things that I always go to when I'm creating a villain now is I actually go over to Hero Forge and I start trying to build uh, a miniature for my villain because it helps me. It's an imperfect visualization, but it helps me put pieces together in my mind. And something that I found with villains is, obviously there's a tendency to make them grotesque because that it's a primal thing. Something that's ugly is something that's off-putting. And so, having a really grotesque, really horrid looking villain is a temptation, but there's also something to be said about the Gus Fring type of villain. The one that's so nondescript, non-threatening upon first glance that when kind of the ultimate evil is revealed of what they've actually done and who they are behind this kind of facade of normalcy, that can be just as terrifying as something that's butt crack ugly and trying to cut their head off with an axe.
Yeah, of course, the physical deformity that signals that that they have some inner flaw. Yeah, it's an old writing trope too. But yeah, Gus Fring, what a great example. Um, it reminded me almost of um, Littlefinger from Game of Thrones.
Mm-hmm.
The first half, we'll say the first half of Game of Thrones before things got dicey. Um, Littlefinger was such an interesting character because you knew he was up to something, but you couldn't nail him on what. And that I found really fascinating is that he was sort of openly nefarious, but not in such a way that he could be that anybody could do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Vic, is it deformities that are considered offensive now? Um, what specifically are you referring to? Oh yeah, giving them a physical flaw. And honestly, I don't. It's a trope that's used a lot. It's a predictable trope, but I also feel like um, it's one of those things that's in a lot of ways kind of narratively appropriate, in that it's like an old school literary flourish.
Hmm.
Almost, it reminds me of like the Scarlet Letter. A lot of the characters in the Scarlet Letter, their names and kind of their physical attributes fit together in a weird way. Like Reverend Dimsdale, the word dim is right there in his name, and when you meet him, he's essentially a shell of a man because of the guilt that he feels. And a lot of the physical description of him almost is summed up in the fact that his name is Reverend Dimsdale. You also see this a lot in Ian Fleming's villains in the James Bond novels. So I don't want to take away from the notion that a deformed evil character is something. Yeah, I think that's a trope that you can use. You just have to be intelligent about it, and you have to employ it in uh, ways that the deformity isn't the like sum of their parts. It's an aspect of who they are internally. It's a reflection of uh, almost kind of what drives them to be what they are.
Yeah, yeah. The reference to James Bond villains is great, and certainly it's very very commonplace writing technique to have the physical appearance of a character sort of telegraph what that character may be like.
Mm-hmm.
Like the devil character in The Master and the Margarita was, if I'm remembering back to my university days, which were little hit and miss. More like he's presented as not an evil character, but I think morally gray in that story, and so he was dressed as gray. But yeah, in a lot of like in a lot of older literature, evil characters had they were scarred or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's again like a lot of tropes, and this is something. That word trope is almost used like a slur sometimes, and it's something that I wish we could get away from because, like a lot of tropes, the physical deformity is something that's a good starting point. A lot of tropes are a good starting point that you can build a kind of bigger foundation on because it's something immediately recognizable that people can latch on to. It's familiar, and then once you hook them with the familiar, you can then build into something new. But it has this foundation, this core that's recognizable, not just you know from modern person to modern person, but even going all the way back to the ancients. These core ideas that almost resonate with us on like the level of our DNA. I think more people need to go back to these simple ideas and these tropes and try to build from them instead of trying to just reject them entirely.
Yeah, and understanding tropes is a good way to, just to go back to twists, if you are wanting to talk about twists or creating something unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding tropes is a good way to like learn how, like, what expectations are people coming into the game with or into a story with, and how can I subvert those. You have a character like the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, who is outwardly fearsome, but is I mean, it's been a while since I've been a child and watched Beauty and the Beast, but like, he's a good person. So that's sort of a subversion.
Yep. Yeah, and even Beast, his beast form is it's like a form of penance put on him by the witch that cursed him. So it's even still like a reflection of something that's inside of him. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's a good point that you make. That it's not the sum of his parts. It's an aspect of him that he's basically had to pay the price of his life for. But once someone is able to look beyond that, that's when he is able to forgive himself and kind of reconcile the beast with the man. And we've gone in some kind of weird philosophical and esoteric directions, which I figured we would, because when you talk about villains, a good villain is a reflection of something nasty but familiar about society. That's why the horror genre exists. Because it resonates with the darker side of people and dark things that we all see in other people and in ourselves. So when you talk about villains, you almost have to get philosophical because that's what good villains do. Is they essentially hold up a mirror to your psyche.
Yeah, I remember in like while I was in university, we talked about in one of my postmodernist literature classes, talked about I think the actual phrase that my professor used was like the outward, like the outward a visible flaw represented a character flaw, which I think was specific to a story we were reading at the time. But we also got into this whole thing about like, why are people so like interested and almost at times enchanted by characters like the Joker or by Hannibal Lecter? Like, why do we find them so fascinating instead of repulsive?
Yeah, I mean, there's several ways you could go with that explanation. Um, I think some people are very much attracted to the darkness, and again they see something that's just kind of primal and human and unapologetic in the villains. I think some people um, almost want to embrace that darkness. I don't know. I feel like I'm psychoanalyzing people at this point, but yeah,
Yeah,
it's
I think some people they want to at times maybe shed the mores and shackles of polite society, and be sort of like, I often say to my wife, you know what, I wish I could be as honest as Larry David for like one day, and just say whatever I thought, and be able to deal with the consequences the way that he does in Curb. Um, but yeah, I think maybe that's a bit of the attraction, is that
Mhm.
people sometimes feel like, you know what, I wish I could go up to that guy who flipped me off in traffic and just lay into him, or I wish I could, you know, if I wish I could be rude to somebody, things as banal as that. I think it
Mhm.
translates into being fascinated with characters, villainous characters who are free of that sort of restriction.
Mhm. Yeah, it's the unchecked id in a lot of ways. A lot of villains are kind of just, the hedonistic pleasure seeking side of the brain gone wild, completely detached from any kind of ego or ego. But now I just sound pretentious, so we should. One topic that I do want to bring up that we should talk about, specifically when it comes to RPGs, because encounters with villains usually involve unraveling machinations that the villain has in place, or even accidentally unraveling machinations in some cases. But when it comes to setting up the dominoes or the Rube Goldberg machine that is the villain's ultimate plan or ultimate goal, what do you usually start with as far as uh, giving the villain something to pursue?
Well, yeah, that's a good starting point. Is like the way that I've done the last few campaigns is that I start with, like, what villain do I want to run? You're playing a game, like, pick a bad guy, pick a monster, pick a character type that you are going to be interested in running, that you're going to enjoy running. Um, and then from there, uh, with really any story, like a villain character uh, should be after the same goal as the protagonists. Like, they're actually after the same thing. They don't have Their goals are not divergent. Their goals are the same.
Mhm.
And you can describe it broadly, like, you know, uh, who's going to have the um, uh, prevailing worldview, uh, or who is going to have control. Like, it could be as broad as that, or who could
Mhm.
have control of the specific resource or specific, um, item or geographical area. Um, so yeah, I kind of I kind of start there, with the villain. What does the villain want? How is that going to how are the players going to deal with that? Because if it's something like, you have a villain and they want control of this specific thing or specific area on your map, and that is of no consequence to your players, then they're going to have no motivation to go stop them.
Mhm.
So what the villain is after also has to be something that the players want.
Yeah.
And and just as an example, I think in the Dark Knight it was like the battle for the soul of Gotham.
Yeah.
Like, are the people of Gotham good, or are they, evil and completely self-interested and detached from morality? Which one is it?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a very important uh, point that a lot of dungeon masters, I think, accidentally overlook. Uh, you may have it in your mind that Sarkhan the One-Eyed is going to muster his forces. He's going to march across the river, and he's going to take over the next town. But if none of your players are invested in the next town, if none of them are from there, if they don't live there, if there's no involvement on their part with that particular town that Sarkhan has his eye focused on. Um, they're they might even join him, just depending on who your players are and what they are looking for in the game. So understanding, in a lot of ways, you almost have to understand what your players want out of the game to then weave your villain into the story, or you need to uh, take what your players want and weave it into the plan that you had already set up for the villain. So at some point, the interests have to intersect, and that's where the conflict comes from. And a lot of GMs forget to do it, or I don't think anyone intentionally doesn't do it, but I think a lot of people assume because we're playing an RPG, they're naturally going to want to overthrow the bad guy. They're going to want to be the heroes. And, sometimes, a lot of times actually, you're dealing with players who don't necessarily care to be the hero just because they've been prescribed that role.
Yeah, yeah. I think I don't know if anybody does this at their table, but for the last few games that I've run, it's been really a lot of emphasis placed on, those sections on the character sheet, your bond, your ideal, your flaw. And then, like I said, I have a questionnaire of about 10 questions that goes beyond that. And I don't know if anybody out there does this, but like, I would recommend not skipping over those sections, not letting your players just take a pass on those. Everybody wants something.
Yeah.
And understanding what every individual member of your party wants is going to, for you as the game master, like it's going to help you steer them. It's going to help you put things in front of them that they're going to want to engage with.
Yeah, a good example of that in your show is Thaddeus. I know I've talked a lot about Thaddeus on the show, and since I brought him up, I might as well. Well,
yeah,
got to throw that out there.
Is he the only character that has a one-word catchphrase? And I should say that I am. I didn't get the T-shirt question when we started, but I am wearing my my Schwett and Shawarma. I know the text is probably backwards, but the shawarma shirt. So Matt invented off the cuff this shawarma chain in our world, and then Kevin drew a what do you call this thing? Like a donair? Yeah. I don't know. I don't eat meat, so I don't. Yeah, it's a sweating meat cylinder, and the motto is or the slogan, the Schwetter the better, for Schwett and shawarma. So Thaddeus loves his shawarma.
Yeah.
And just as an aside, I was playing Hunt Showdown with Matt about a year ago, and I had been in the local grocery store and I saw that Dawson's hot sauce had a shawarma sauce, and I said, Matt, because I knew that Matt likes hot sauce, and I said, Matt, Dawson's has a shawarma sauce, dude. And he says, yeah, I don't really care much for shawarma that much. It's more of a Thaddeus thing.
I don't know Matt at all. I've never spoken to him. I've spoken to his wife, but I don't know him. But the fact that he has essentially turned Thaddeus into like an alternate persona from his own that coexists within his head just endlessly amuses me.
Yeah. Sorry, I feel like I derailed things for a minute there. We were talking about Thaddeus's drive,
Hmm.
his bond,
Yep.
his ideal, which is all of the above: vengeance, bond, vengeance, ideal, vengeance, flaw, vengeance.
Yep. But yeah, his kind of narrative buy-in as far as wanting revenge on the people who betrayed him. Uh, Essentially, you've been given kind of like free villains in that regard to work into the plot that your big bad has cooking. Because if they weren't involved at all in the plan, if they had no affiliation with the bad guy whatsoever, in any way, uh, it would be a temptation for Thaddeus to just completely ignore the plot, or even if the villain kind of dangled out in front of him, I will show you where the people are that you want to kill. At that point, you've got a PC going villainous for the sake of their own kind of goals, which has happened in one of my games before. I had to take a character. Well, they surrendered their character sheet willingly, but I had a point where one of my player characters was like, I don't know of any reason why he would turn down this offer to go to the dark side. And I was just like, all right,
Whoa.
he's an NPC at this point then.
Was that character just gone out of the game, or did they come back
Oh, that character came
as
back
a
several times.
several times? That's a challenge because, like, usually in my experience, a villain shows up once and is killed.
Hmm. This
um,
this villain
yeah.
ended up becoming a very high level wizard at a certain point. So he disappeared for a while and then came back, and at that point he had learned how to clone himself. So
Ooh, very nice. Yeah, in campaign one, I had a doppelganger who um, I was planning to have them be sort of a recurring nuisance. I think the party was maybe level 4 at that point, so they're still pretty low. And first encounter, they cornered him in an alley. There's a brief chase, but the rogue's backstab was too much for this lone doppelganger to withstand, and so Mago, the doppelganger, was slain. But yeah, so I learned after that, taking another piece of advice from the podcast I mentioned earlier. Um, there's a trick in the first Mass Effect game where Mass Effect is like an open. I think it's a semi-open world sort of thing.
yep, yep.
But you're supposed to have a degree of freedom as a player that you're used to, and so there's a character named Saren, betrays you and interacts with you later on, like after the betrayal, and is lying. And you as a player, you're like, you know what? I would just take out my gun and I would put Saren down like right here. Like he's betrayed me. He's lying about it. So the way that the game designers dealt with that was that they had Saren hologram in. You can't. Well, you can shoot a hologram, but you're going to look like a crazy person.
Yep.
So after Mago got killed, one and done. I had this other villainous character named Arizax who showed up as an illusion to sort of work off for the characters a degree of cooperation. And you can't kill an illusion, and in that way, it's a good way to have the villain recur without having to have them, fight and really trounce the party over and over again. I mean, me personally, I often lament about my encounter designing abilities. So I feel like my encounters are either too tough or they're a cakewalk. And I kind of like, it's usually more of a cakewalk thing. And so maybe other people are better with having villains have a good challenging fight and then escape. If you're able to do that, please drop me a line because I'd really love to know how. But basically, I had Arizax show up in a way that he could communicate with the party. He could sort of convey his his arrogance, and the party could interact with him, and they could grow to hate him more and more, up to the eventual encounter where it was one encounter and they killed him.
Hmm. To answer Vic's question, you run in 5e, um, which and that is a very common problem. Uh, I think that a lot of people who run 5e have is it's either way too easy or it's way too difficult, and there doesn't seem to be a good middle ground in 5e where it's challenging, uh, but you're not essentially like decking the players in one turn, uh, regardless of action economy. Because I, honestly, that's as big a problem in fifth edition as things being too easy at times. Is when you do ramp things up, when you do like kind of really up the ante, the equation doesn't quite balance as well as it should, and you end up with a villain that, if they get to go first, or even if they're going like third, they're going to kill a player character in one turn.
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of Matt Colville's one of his videos where he was talking about running an encounter, and I think what he said, just to paraphrase, was like, round one, just let your biggest gun go, really hit them hard with like a big opening salvo, and then you pull back.
Mm.
um I think I've done that a couple times, and when was the last time that it happened? It may have been the gibbering dragon, from this most recent campaign. I think had a few nasty tricks, and that was a pretty tense fight. I was happy with that, how that fight turned out.
Mm. Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned Matt Colville, as well as talking about making villains recur, because a couple months ago Matt Colville had a video about villains, um, and talked a lot about making sure that the villain's presence is constantly felt. And he raised an idea that he seemed to be very enthusiastic about, that I was repulsed by. And I even rewatched the video today, and I'm still repulsed by this idea in an RPG. He basically said you need to have cutscenes of the villain talking to their lieutenants in the middle of your RPG sessions. Uh, so basically, you have to cut back to Lord Zed on his throne talking to Goldar, or you need to cut to the boardroom in Austin Powers. And, and I know, like, I just raised like two ridiculous examples, but specifically when it comes to RPGs, you can't take the focus off what the players, like what their characters are experiencing and seeing, because there's not a good way at that point to differentiate between what the players know and what the characters know. And it's important to make sure that the focus is tightly on the characters and what they perceive, and not cutting over to the GM role playing with themselves, monologuing about evil plans and how the players are foiling them. I don't know where that idea came from in his mind. I don't know why that seems to be the solution he settled on, but I what are your thoughts on that? I personally don't like that at all.
I haven't seen the video that you're referring to, but I'm I'm thinking that like, just to go back to like what we were talking about earlier um about giving opportunities to the players and the player characters to learn. I feel like just handing that over to them is kind of, almost like taking away an opportunity for them to have a really rewarding experience. Like, if you want to, if you're I guess if you're doing that,
Mm.
maybe somebody's figured out a way to make it, uh, work where you're not like divulging a whole lot of information. If it's a scene where, I guess, where the villain is maybe throwing like a paperweight at his lieutenant for like messing up this operation that the PCs were involved with. Like, you got defeated by these rat catchers, sort of thing. It's not really. I guess it's kind of giving them a little bit of extra. Congratulations on foiling this particular plan. But if it's like actual information, I don't know. Like, was that what he was going for?
It seemed like he just wanted reminders to the players that they were actually like accomplishing something. He wasn't talking about like divulging crucial information, but it was like I don't know, it struck me very much as Saturday morning cartoon, like I said, cutting back to Lord Zed or Evil Emperor Zurg, like smashing a computer console and being like, "Darn you, you'll pay for this."
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be a trick that I would employ. I would prefer to go with other ways to show the presence of the villain. If you're dealing with a cult, then maybe there's like the influence of your cult is of the villain's cult is spreading throughout the city, and you have like at the start of the game there's like one sort of doomsayer who's preaching just to nobody in the town market, and then a few sessions in they're preaching to like a group of 10, and then a few sessions after that they're preaching to a group of 50, and maybe there's more of them, more of these doomsayers out on the streets. Maybe there's a blood red moon, something like that, a sign of the cult's malevolent influence. I think I'd probably go with something a little bit more like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I understand the need to have the villain's presence be felt constantly. I feel like one of the best ways to do that is with lieutenants. And also kind of visual, like you said, kind of visual representation that things are starting to get worse, that the noose is tightening around the players' necks. To use the Sarkhan, the one-eyed example again, if they're continuously being a thorn in his side in his capital city, they might start seeing their faces on wanted posters, or they might start seeing that, hey, the city guard is, a lot more heavily armed, and they're patrolling in greater numbers than we originally saw. I feel like that is a little bit more effective than essentially just, reminding them that the villain exists and is not happy with what they're doing. I feel like there's subtler and more interesting ways to do that.
Yeah, if Sarkhan the One-Eyed is, besieging a town, you're even if it's one town over and your party is at an inn and say, "Oh, I want this meat," like, "Oh, sorry, we're out." The siege, 10 miles over is where we get our supplies from. Nothing's coming out of that town. Or, you look out one day and the normally beautiful sunrise is marred by smoke as Sarkon's armies are burning. Or even, if your party frequents taverns, throw a bard in there who's singing about recent occurrences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be. Now you've got me thinking about, like, what if they encountered a pro Sarkhan bard? You always, I feel like bards are always.
I'm pro Sarkhan and I vote.
I feel like bards are always kind of like subversive to the bad guys' plans. That, like, obviously, Lord Sarkhan the One-Eyed, as I presented him, is some kind of noble or monarch of some description. People like that have propagandists. People like that are charismatic and are able to sway people to their sides, and will have agents who do the same thing. So, I think it would be interesting to have players kind of roll up into a tavern that's very much against what they're doing. And, like their ringleader is a super charismatic, uh, like troubadour or bard or something like that, that is actively riling up the people against them. I think that would be an interesting thing to throw at players.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just picturing like the minstrels that Sir Robin had in the Holy Grail, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but in a tavern and mocking the players
Yeah.
using the same sort of maturity level of insults.
Hmm.
They'd be super effective. Psychic damage for sure.
Absolutely. Turn that vicious mockery on them for a change.
Yeah, but even Thanos had Ebony Maw, who was I don't know if he was that way in the comics, but in the movies he was almost like a preacher for Thanos. Like this is embrace the undeniable vision of Thanos.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the Silver Surfer is also that way in the comics. He's the Herald of Galactus. So, uh, when he shows up, it's generally to subjugate people before Galactus shows up and eats their world. So, having a forebearer like that, even if it's not necessarily a threatening one, just some kind of like weaselly cleric or bureaucrat with a silver tongue or something like that. That's an interesting conundrum to put players in and to remind them of the threat that's around them, especially if it's someone who's well liked and high placed in society. Like if the mayor of the town that they're headquartered in is suddenly a very vocal supporter of Sarkhan the One-Eyed. Things have changed. They've escalated, but not in a way that the players could necessarily just like kick in his door and cut his head off, because that's going to have its own set of problems.
Yeah, so now you're gonna have to differentiate between a villain and an antagonist. An antagonist is simply a character who is working at cross purposes from your protagonists, but maybe not necessarily someone that they want to harm or kill. So your mayor, who is convinced of Lord Sarkhan's vision, may be an antagonist, but not a villain. Maybe somebody that they could persuade to see a different point of view. So it's great to have those kind of characters in there for your social encounters, where you don't want everything to resort to violence. If you want to have those types of encounters. But your true villains, they are true believers. They can't be persuaded. They're not doing what they're doing because they're under a misapprehension or anything like that. They're like zealots. They believe what they believe to a degree, that they have to see it through no matter the cost. And oftentimes the end justifies the means.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's another thing that I think is overlooked with a lot of villains, especially ones that are amassing large power bases. Not everyone is going to be a true believer, and so you're going to have some threats who are, purely mercenary. Maybe some of the soldiers that you're fighting are just doing so for the coin, and with sufficient persuasion or even a bribe here or there, they might be convinced to lay down their arms and go in a different direction. You also have people who are otherwise reasonable, normal human beings who've just been kind of taken in by uh, you know loud promises and fancy talk that appeals to something that they want to see happen. And those people, again, you can't just go around like lopping people like that's heads off, because ultimately they're they're just as much the victim as you are in a lot of ways, because it's not going to turn out the way they think it will.
If they go that route, you'll have an Obi-Wan type NPC saying, "You've become the very thing you swore to destroy."
Yeah. And I think that goes back to ways that villains can challenge players morally and intellectually, uh, in addition to or instead of physically. Because when you present stuff like that, you present not just different kinds of challenges, but also alternate paths to success. Now, it's still heroic fantasy or sword and sorcery. Usually, it's going to end in some kind of violent confrontation, and a lot of players want it to be that way because that's the genre, that's the game we're playing. But not every single thing along the way has to be a long drawn out session of combat, because if it is, then that's where you get a repetitive samey game. And for you who's running a game not just as a game but as a form of entertainment, beyond just the game being played at the table, you don't want things that feel samey, otherwise your audience tunes out. And those of us who just play games to play games, you don't want your game to feel samey to the players at the table, otherwise they're just going to go, oh, here we go again, and they're not going to be invested.
Yeah. I mean, if every challenge, or if every obstacle, I should say, ends in combat,
Mm-hmm.
then there's going to be a point where you're going to present something to them that maybe you don't want to end in combat, and they're going to jump to that because that's that's the solution, um,
Yep.
that they've been sort of conditioned to engage with. Yeah, the way that I've tried to incorporate it with like this campaign and the last one is to give the players choices, and I've tried to bake in a couple of dilemmas and giving them like choices between two suboptimal outcomes.
Yeah.
Um, so in I guess in the current game, Thaddeus, the Oath of Vengeance paladin, was given a choice by the subject of his Oath of Vengeance, so his nemesis, was offering to help him against a stronger enemy, or Thaddeus could have fought and potentially killed him then and there, and then would have still had to have dealt with that enemy afterwards. So either way, it's not a great choice for Thaddeus.
Yeah.
Um, Having to work with the person that he hates the most, um, or kill that person that he's sworn to kill, and fulfill that promise to himself, and then proceed on to another fight that would be even more difficult, without the help of this other character.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Thomas Sowell once said, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So presenting those situations where you're having to pick between two or more bad options, uh, that's where that's where you can really challenge a player.
Yeah, that's where that's where you get you get them thinking about not what spell am I going to use next, but like what is my character going to do, because like those are the choices that really change the outcome of the game. Like when I presented that choice to Thaddeus, I think that was around episode 30, 28, 27. I thought that they were going to fight and that Bryce would be dead. Um, I haven't been correct in many of my assumptions about what the party is going to do. That's kind of a running thing. I should do like the George Costanza thing and like do the opposite of whatever my gut instinct says. Um, but yeah. So that was one choice, and there's been a couple other choices, there's one that's sort of unfolding right now, even as we're playing. But that's one choice that really is going to uh, really impact like how the story ends. Um, and that was a choice like not mine as the game master. That was totally on Matt and the party, how they wanted to approach it. So all I had to do was show them the doors, and they chose which ones to walk through.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, as tends to happen when you and I talk on this show, time has gotten well away from me, and I wish we could, keep talking for another hour or so. But unfortunately, we are up against our time right now.
Has it been an hour?
It's been an hour and 15.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, yeah, no, that's wow. Yeah, time did fly.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, as always, I really appreciate talking with you about stuff like this. Even when we got into the weeds on kind of like esoteric philosophical concepts, I think that's a good mindset to have when it comes to the villains that we're creating is kind of to get into those nitty gritty topics and really dig into what it means for this villain to be a villain.
Yeah. Yeah. And about what I said before about physical tells, that I was referring. I just want to be clear. I was referring to literature that I was studying in university. Sort of classic literature and some analysis of it. Like, I have a scar above my eye doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, other than I'm a psychopath. Other than that, I'm totally normal.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. These are these are concepts of storytelling
Yeah.
that are they don't translate one to one to the real world, but in storytelling everything is symbolic, and so that's what we're dealing with is symbolic concepts.
Yeah, yeah. And like the villain, for me as a starting point, it's a great jumping off point, because like the challenge that you set before your players is, what and the choices they make is what like defines them. Sorry, I don't want to run us over time, but one of the questions on the questionnaire that I put is like, for when we're just starting a game, is how do you see your character changing over the course of this campaign? And that to me is, when they answer that, I say, okay, how can the villains that I'm running, how can they incorporate this change? Maybe I'm just doing like extra steps where they're not needed, but certainly when new superhero movies are coming out, everyone's like, oh, who's the new villain in this one? It's because like the villains sort of define like the hero's journey.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's always great to have conversations with you, and we'll definitely need to do this again sometime soon.
I am thrilled that my power stayed on. It went out twice today, but I'm very happy I didn't have to abruptly leave you. And I'm sure that like my face would have been frozen in some kind of weird expression, but I'm glad that didn't happen.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, that's going to do it for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us here on Rollin' Bones. Next week, to kick off 2023, Legacy Game Mastering is going to be on here. We're going to be talking about the word community, what it means in the sense of RPGs. We'll also be talking about several other topics. So I hope you guys will join me then. But until then, whether you rolled a 1 or a 20, I'm so glad that you rolled your bones with me, Ryan Howard, and I will see you guys next time.